Hey, welcome to 49cc Scoot. My name's Brent. I got this bug-eye style Yamaha Zuma from a customer stating that it needed to be tuned. He had installed a 70cc Polini Corsa big bore kit and Polini crank, Yasuni Z exhaust, and a 21mm Polini CP carburetor with a pod filter, and it had some issues. I rode with its owner the night before with a group, and he told me that it had a 102 main jet and 40 pilot jet, but it wouldn't stay running at idle even with the idle speed screw turned in. He also complained of slow takeoff, and the owner and another friend that tried it out briefly said it feels strong once it gets going. So my assumption was that the main jet was probably close, but the pilot jet was likely off, and/or it had an air leak, and probably needed some clutch and CVT tuning. I was also informed that it had a Melosi CDI, and he had to wire a relay in to make sure the key and kill switch would work so the bike could be turned on and off. But that stopped working, as did the electric start. The owner would just let the engine stall out since it wouldn't idle, but otherwise he was pulling off the spark plug wire to shut it down. Listen, sometimes you do what you have to do, but this is not a practice that I'd advise since it can give you a shock. Step one for me was to push it into the shade and check out the idle for myself. It idled high on a cold start and smoked plenty without the manual choking gauge, so that made me think that it's running very rich at low throttle. As it warmed up, idle RPM dropped, eventually to a point where it wouldn't keep running. If I hit the gas to keep it going, it chugged out smoke. This bike is pre-mixed, by the way, so it was either rich in some throttle positions or it had a heavy oil mix. I tried adjusting the idle mixture screw and the idle speed screw and couldn't really get anywhere. I did get it to idle after turning the speed screw in more, but then the throttle stuck when I twisted it. Apparently with these carbs you can actually turn the idle speed screw in enough that it won't let the slide return, so I backed it off a bit and then it went back to stalling out. Next, I replaced the left mirror with an inductive pickup tuning tack that I use so I can monitor RPM. I took the Scoot for a test ride with my draggy on board to observe the described takeoff issues for myself. The first run went about as I expected, with a slow launch, but it pulled okay once it got going, and I thought 1456 at 47.18 miles per hour wasn't bad for a bike with a weak launch, and clearly some low-speed mixture issues. I normally do 4 runs to get a good average and keep results repeatable, so I tried again. Perfect, just what you want on the first test run. Let's see what it feels like. Oh, we got no compression. That's perfect. Might just put a hole in the piston. Just knowing that the carb may need adjustment, I probably would have taken a different approach and put a larger main jet in there just to be safe. But I rode with the owner and it looked like he had to be running it hard taking off, and I knew he was going 50 plus, so I never worried about testing it as it came to me. I got the Zuma home and it still had absolutely no compression, so I was pretty confident that I was going to find a hole in the piston. I strapped it to the bench to remove body panels, since the Zuma seat bucket bolts are hidden under plastics instead of under the seat for easy removal like many other scooters. I started taking off parts to access the cylinder, beginning with the carb and air filter. I initially planned to replace the pod filter with a stock airbox, because I think they're easier to tune and maintain. But this is the first time that I've worked with a Polini CP carb, and while it is very compact, it has a 47mm mouth, so adapting it down to 35mm to fit an airbox covers a lot of the inlet and seems less than ideal to me. As expected, there was a big hole in the piston. The head looked pretty good, all things considered, with just a little molten piston stuck to it. The cylinder had some scuffing, but I couldn't feel most of it with a fingernail, and thankfully it looked like a new piston kit, wrist pin bearing, gaskets, and some cleanup work would get the top end ready to go again. I chopped the threads off of the spark plug, and of course found aluminum residue and very little coloring of the porcelain otherwise. The mixture ring, which is right at the base of the porcelain where it meets up with the metal part of the plug before being cut apart, was only a fine line. The thicker the mixture ring, the richer the tune generally, so it's safe to say a 102 main jet was too small in this case. I wanted to get a parts order in so I could progress with the job as soon as possible, so I took the CVT apart as well to see what was in there. I was told that the belt sat pretty far into the rear pulley, so I didn't know if it had the wrong belt, needed drive ball shims, the whole CVT was stock, or needed stiffer clutch springs, or exactly what I'd find. I thought the belt would be sitting in a much worse position than it was, but there was still room for improvement. It turned out to have a whole NCY Super transmission kit and a Polini belt of proper spec, so I removed all of that and the starter clutch parts and proceeded to clean off the caked on belt and who knows what else residue on the case. Then I started taking every part of the CVT apart to inspect and clean it, beginning with the clutch and rear pulley. The NCY clutch at least had stiff red springs in it, but I can't say that I was impressed by what appears to be a stock clutch painted green, possibly with different friction material. The bell looks like an improvement over stock, with lots of cutouts and some lines swirled into the contact area. I also like the very compact torsion controller that moves easily, and the kit has a 1500 RPM NCY contra spring with it. The rear pulley had a lot of resistance opening and closing, enough that I knew something had to be wrong with it. Nothing more than a quick smear of grease was in the torque driver, which should normally have plenty of grease to keep it working smoothly. The front fixed pulley looked alright, but having no fan blades to move air in a CVT that has no ventilation wouldn't be my first choice. The NCY Variator looks a lot like a stock Variator to me. This is a Moto 4 stock replacement Variator on the right, and there's not much obvious difference. I'd bet it's not the best design, but at least it's aftermarket, and even minor changes can provide improvements, so we'll see how it goes when the scoot runs again. I moved on to see if anything would be needed to fix the issue where the modified ignition disabling circuit and electric starter quit working. A quick check of the battery showed less than 3 volts, which is really bad. With the key on, it dropped to less than 50 millivolts, or 0.05 volts. It's quite safe to say that that battery was toast, so I added a new one to my list as well, thinking that would probably solve the electrical issues because obviously the starter isn't going to crank the engine over with essentially no power. And if a relay is being used to switch the ignition signal from run to kill or vice versa, the relay needs both power and ground to operate, so most likely it would also function again with a good power supply. Once I ordered parts, I went back to the CVT, beginning by thoroughly cleaning the rear pulley. The NCY torque driver has 3 sets of paths, all at different angles for fine tuning. None of them are marked, so I used a spring-loaded center punch to put 1, 2, and 3 dots above each set of grooves to make it easier for anyone that services or tunes this thing in the future. I gave it a generous helping of grease and assembled the pulley in the medium, now number 2, set of grooves. There we go, now the pulley moves like it should. I cleaned the clutch and then sat it on the rear pulley to see if the pulley would open all the way. Nope, pretty much every rear pulley and clutch I've tried this with can't get full travel without a spacer. I'd really like to find a source to buy spacers because making them takes too long, But when I've looked for shims in the right size, they either match the inside or the outside diameter close enough, but not both. Please post in the comments if you know a source for these. I cleaned the variator next. It had a mix of 5 and 6 gram rollers in it, and the tune seemed close, but I don't like rollers much because they tend to flat spot so quickly, and these already had flat spots forming, so I put in 5.5 gram Dr. Pulley sliders and replaced one of the slide bushings of the ramp plate that was cracked. Next, I got the cylinder kit ready for when the new piston arrived, starting by putting the head in the mini lathe to make cleanup easier. I did a little spot sanding for the aluminum deposits. I finished up with a quick polish to make sure it was smooth. The exhaust port had a little aluminum in it and a couple of areas that I wanted to smooth, and the header flange had once molten aluminum to be cleaned out as well. I also rounded off some sharp edges around the cylinder skirts while I had the rotary tool out. I did a quick hone on the cylinder before washing it very thoroughly. Scuff marks are still visible, but I can't feel them, so I expect this kit to work just fine. The owner switched the Zuma to premix, but I noticed that the oil pump was still installed, and that area was pretty dirty, so I took it apart to remove the pump totally and clean it up a bit. In my opinion, the pump isn't necessary to keep as a block off, so it might as well be removed to save some tiny amount of weight. The intake and reeds were removed next so I could check those out later, but it also gave me a better ability to flush the crankcases out. When anything fails internally in these two-strokes, whether it's a piston or a wrist pin bearing or a ring, debris often hangs around inside of the crankcase and even can make its way into the exhaust. If you don't get it all out, you can fix the engine and fire it back up, only to have leftovers ruin the crank, bearings, or cylinder kit again. Trust me, I've learned this the hard way through experience. I used kerosene with a battery-operated pump that normally fills my heaters to flush the cases out very thoroughly. I think I went through about a gallon of kerosene that had quite a bit of glitter in it after flushing, rotating the crank, flushing more, and so on. I also found some minor aluminum deposits on top of the connecting rod that I sanded off quickly with Scotch-Brite pads, but thankfully nothing got inside of the rod. The stock intake fits the 21mm Polini carb well, but there's a big ridge just after the outlet, so I smoothed and blended that area. The match between the V-Force reed block stuffer and the intake was already good, so I didn't have to mess with it. I disassembled, inventoried, and cleaned the carburetor. A 102 main jet sounded like a pretty good size to me, until I saw that the jet kit the customer provided started at 100 and went to 118. I put the 118 in to start out as safe as I could. I removed the silencer from the exhaust to verify that there were no restrictors and to get ready to clean the pipe. The exhaust is pretty new, but the carbon fiber wrap is already starting to peel off. I put a hose clamp around it later, hoping that would keep it from getting worse. There was a little lump of weld left over from the restrictor that comes in the header, so I ground that out. I blew compressed air through the exhaust to get rid of any potential leftovers from the piston failure or my grinding before cleaning, reassembling, and wiping the exhaust down with oil for rust prevention. Parts arrived, including a new piston kit, wrist pin bearing, 5mm spacer to move the reed block up out of the path of the ports, intake gaskets, and some 1 heat range colder NGK spark plugs. The reed spacer was so inexpensive that I thought I might as well do it while the intake was off anyway. I rounded off the sharp edges around the bottom of the piston and made sure the ring end gaps met minimum clearance specs. A quick mock-up assembly let me check squish clearance, which was 0.84 millimeters, so no change was necessary. I installed a block-off plate on the exhaust port for a future pressure test before installing the cylinder with a new gasket kit. I put my leak tester in the intake and let it sit overnight so the RTV on the intake and base gaskets would have time to set up before pressurizing the engine. It passed a 30-minute leak test at just under 7 psi, so I reassembled the rest of the engine and transmission. I put just the drive boss on the crankshaft so I could see the maximum travel the belt was capable of in the rear pulley, and it looked to be pretty much perfect, sitting just outside of the edge. Then I actually installed the variator to see how the belt sat. Quite a difference. Certainly not the worst I've seen, but when the belt sits into the rear pulley like this, it tends to hurt launch in a couple of ways. The most obvious is that it changes the ratio of the pulleys at takeoff, not providing the best low gear for lack of a better term. Basically not allowing the scooter to make full use of its range of drive ratios. The second way, which I think some people miss, is that it changes how the clutch engages. People tend to think of the clutch engaging relative to engine RPM, but it actually engages based on clutch RPM. So if the belt is all the way to the outside of the rear pulley, then the clutch will rotate at a lower RPM than if the belt is sitting far in the rear pulley. Because of this, the clutch won't engage until a higher engine RPM if the belt sits further outward in the rear pulley. So you wind up with not only a better takeoff ratio, but also rev the engine a little more before the clutch grabs. I played around with different shims and found that 1.1 millimeter would let the belt sit pretty far out. Not wanting to use more shimming than necessary because that can reduce the belt travel on the opposite end and lead to lower top speeds. With a new battery installed, I tried to start the scooter. I could not get it to fire up with anything that I tried, so I verified that I indeed have spark. I did more checks and even tried a different CDI in case the timing was off. I thought it may just be too rich to start with a 118 main jet, but I put a Chinese stock carb on for a quick test to see if that let it start. Okay, so it's definitely a carburetor problem. Made even more obvious by the raw fuel that came out from the exhaust when it started. But first I had to deal with a malfunctioning Kickstarter after so much kicking during all of the no starts. I found that the return spring wasn't holding the gear anymore because the end of the spring that is supposed to be bent up to engage with the gear was flattened out. I had another spring and a new collar around, so I got the kicker working well again. Then I went back to the Polini carb and replaced the 118 main jet with a 115, not wanting to go any leaner than I had to. And it still didn't start, so I switched the 40 pilot jet for a 34. Finally, it started with the Polini carb, but it chugged smoke and the mixture screw had to be way out with the idle speed screw turned way in. I went down to the smallest pilot jet that I had, a 32, and it felt better, but low throttle still seemed very rich, so I moved the needle clip up one notch to lean it more. It idled better and was more responsive to mixture adjustments. While it was running, I verified that the stator was trying to charge the battery, just to be sure that that wasn't the cause of the dead battery that I replaced earlier. I wanted to give the engine a little bit of break-in time with the new piston before I started running it hard for the tuning process. It was very rich, with only a couple of spots in the throttle that would let me go at a decent pace, and it just kept getting worse and worse. Eventually, I was struggling to get it to move at all. It found a brand new spark plug in just 17 miles, so I swapped that on the side of the road, and it went back to just feeling horribly rich, but rideable. My first change was replacing the 115 main jet with a 110. It was still very rich at low to mid throttle, but it ran okay wide open, so I did some 8th mile passes. Takeoff improved a lot, with better results overall. I got it up to 55 miles per hour GPS. It felt like it might run a little stronger with a smaller main jet, but it melted the piston last time with a 102, and I was at a 110 just to get it to quit breaking up and run smooth wide open. There was a 108 in the kit, which I would call a half step from 110, and generally a half step is fine tuning to me. So at this point, the main jet is about 1.5 steps from where it melted a piston, yet I thought it might be just a little bit rich for max performance. I chopped the plug to see what the mix ring told me. It looked good and safe to me, possibly with room for improvement, but I didn't think it was worth the risk of getting any closer to a known failure point. At least not yet. I decided to try some CVT tuning first and see what I thought after that, starting by going from 5.5 to 5 gram weights. I also marked the throttle so I could get a more precise idea of where the rich area was. It turned out to be right around quarter throttle that it got very rich, but for now my primary focus was getting it going well wide open. For some reason it started bogging off the line, which isn't what I'd expect to happen from less roller weight, but it did rev about 200 to 250 RPM higher once it got going. The result was worse, but I wasn't sure how much was from the poor launch and how much was from RPM. When I checked the CVT, the belt was sitting way into the rear pulley again. But I hadn't changed anything that should affect that. The only thing that made any sense to me was perhaps when hot the belt gripped more and didn't want to move out as easily, but normally this isn't something that I see. Spacing requirements don't tend to just suddenly change. I double checked to be sure that I hadn't accidentally used 16 by 13 sliders that would take up more space instead of 15 by 12, But they were all 15 by 12, so I added shims on the dry boss until the belt once again sat pretty far out. I wound up going from 1.1 millimeters to 2.5 millimeters of shimming, which is a big change, and I couldn't really go much more because I was running out of splines to engage with the kickstart gear. Went back to about where it was when I made the first passes, and RPM increased a bit more from the shimming, but times were worse than the first pass, and RPM was increasing a lot by the end of runs. I only went 50 miles per hour, so clearly the spacing of the front pulley was having a negative effect on speed. I moved down to 2 millimeters of shims and 4.5 gram weights, wanting to see what happened if I could raise acceleration RPM without reducing speed more. Times were similar, and my speed improved to 52 miles per hour, but I think it likes to stay closer to 10,000 RPM. I moved the needle clip one notch to the leanest position and readjusted the idle settings. That gave me a better idle and less richness low throttle, but it didn't change acceleration. Back to the CVT, I tried 5 gram weights with the same 2 millimeters of shimming. Times were almost identical to 5 gram weights with 2.5 millimeter spacing, but RPM didn't shoot up so much at speed, and it went a few miles per hour faster. By then I was realizing that this cylinder and pipe combo seemed to like right around 10,000 RPM, so I put in 5.5 gram weights again. It pretty well matched the first runs after my work, but with less speed and more RPM at speed, so I reduced shimming to 1.5 millimeters. The really strange part is that somehow the belt was back to the outside of the pulley with similar spacing to what I started out with now. The belt wasn't wearing a lot, so I'm really not sure why it transitioned the way it did, but it ran well, so whatever I guess. Good results are good results. It ran the best times with RPM staying from about 9,850 to 10,000 RPM for most of the 8th mile. I forgot to check the GPS speed on the draggy, but I'm confident that it was around 55 miles per hour again based on how it was picking up with the other changes. I think it would continue to gain speed if I remove the shims, but then it's going to go back to taking off slower, so I called the CVT Tuning done at that point. I chopped all of the plugs that I used in the process. The mixture rings look good on every plug that I used a 110 on. And again, I thought that there may be some improvement with a 108, both in performance and low throttle richness, but I just was not willing to take that step on a customer's bike that I had already melted one piston on. That left me with the only remaining issue being some richness around quarter throttle. I had already tried about anything that I could with what I had, and I knew that needle clip changes and smaller main jets were the only things that really worked toward clearing it up. The idle mixture screw was a couple of turns out, so the pilot jet should be okay, and I had nothing smaller than a 32 anyway. I looked at needles for the Polini CP Carb, and it looked like they only make 2, and I already had the leaner of the 2, so that's no help. It had a 30 throttle valve, so my best guess was that a 40 throttle valve might be the answer, because it has a larger cutaway to reduce the sensitivity at low throttle and lean it out a little bit. Ultimately, I decided not to do it because I'd have to spend another $30 of the customer's money and make them wait probably near another week by the time I could get one and then try it, and overall it was running pretty well. I called the tune done and gave the bike a bath before starting to put it back together. Pretty much everything on this Zuma was dirty when I got it, so I cleaned the body panels inside and out before they went back on. The rear side panels had one tab broken completely off in the back and the other with half of it cracked, so I used a hot stapler to reinforce the cracked side. Then I cut a piece of ABS plastic to fit the other side and stapled that on as well. None of this cleanup or repair was requested, by the way, but I also didn't bill for it. I'm just trying to help and make people happy with their scooters when I can. In the end, the scoot wound up being about a second and a half quicker in the 8th mile, with a lot stronger takeoff, and now it will actually start and idle. I was very tempted to take out literally 20 pounds of tools that I carried under the seat on every test run and see if I could get a high 12-second average. But as much as I wanted to get those numbers, that doesn't really help the customer, so I didn't ride it anymore. Just a couple of nights ago while we were riding, the owner let a 170-pound rider try it out. And it did 12:04 and 12:07 back to back, and speed went up to 51 to 52 miles per hour. That's about it for this one, so please give me a like if you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, and subscribe for more scooter content. As always, thank you for watching.